The silverware clinked softly against porcelain, the only sound breaking the heavy silence between them. Elizabeth reached for the salt shaker, her fingers grazing the cool glass before sliding it across the table. Richard took it without looking up, eyes fixed on the documents spread before him. 5 years of marriage, 13 years together, and this was what their conversations had become. Empty gestures, mechanical exchanges. She watched him for a moment, searching for something familiar in the man she had once loved so effortlessly. The man who had once sketched dream homes on the back of napkins, whispering about the future they'd build together. But that man had been swallowed whole by the machine of her family's empire. Now, Richard Clark was a businessman first, a husband second, and a stranger most of all. "How was the hospital today?" His voice was distant, more out of obligation than curiosity. Elizabeth pushed the vegetables around on her plate. "The same. No change." She didn't need to elaborate. 3 years of fertility treatments, injections, invasive procedures, each ending in quiet disappointment. Each failure building a wall between them, brick by invisible brick. She felt the weight of it pressing down, suffocating, but Richard never spoke of it. Not really. He just sighed, just like he did now, setting his pen down before taking a sip of his wine. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. The Clark name must continue. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Richard understood it too. He had been handpicked by George Brown, molded into the perfect successor for Brown Real Estate. At first, it had been a dream. Access, power, influence. But Elizabeth knew the cost. The deeper Richard sank into the family business, the more he became theirs, not hers. "You haven't forgotten about tomorrow night, have you?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Richard barely glanced up. "Your parents and Victoria are coming over, right?" Her stomach tightened at the mention of her sister. Victoria, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. The one their parents adored, while Elizabeth had always been the afterthought. "She said she has some news to share," Elizabeth added, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Richard finally met her gaze. "She's been doing well. I heard she set record sales figures for your father's latest project." The admiration in his tone stung more than it should have. Elizabeth forced a smile. "Of course, another grand achievement." Richard didn't catch the sarcasm. Or maybe he just chose to ignore it. The phone rang. Richard stood, excusing himself as he disappeared into the kitchen, his voice lowering as he answered. Elizabeth stared at the empty space he left behind, listening to the quiet hum of his conversation. A part of her wondered if she should care more, if she should demand to know who he was talking to, why he always seemed distracted, why she felt like she was grasping at smoke when it came to their marriage. Instead, she turned to the window, watching the snow fall in slow, hypnotic drifts. Tomorrow, everything would change. The clink of crystal glasses and the hum of polite conversation filled the grand dining room, but Elizabeth felt like an outsider at her own table. The warmth of the chandelier overhead did nothing to soften the cold, calculated atmosphere that always accompanied these family gatherings. Victoria sat across from her, radiant as ever, her laughter effortless, her presence commanding. Even as a child, she had held the room in the palm of her hand, dazzling their parents with her charm, her beauty, her talent. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had been the quiet one, the responsible one, the one expected to blend into the background. "Before we get to dessert," Victoria said, setting down her wine glass with a flourish, I have some exciting news. Elizabeth braced herself. I've been promoted. Her mother gasped, delighted. Her father nodded in approval. Richard, her husband, smiled. They've made me director of sales for the entire East Coast division. Victoria continued, her eyes sparkling. Dad, your little girl is officially leading the biggest market in the company. George Brown's face lit up with rare pride. That's my Victoria. I knew you'd be the one to take Brown Real Estate to new heights. Elizabeth forced a tight-lipped smile, ignoring the way her mother reached over to squeeze Victoria's hand, beaming like she had just won an Olympic gold medal. That's incredible, Richard said, his voice genuine, his admiration unmistakable. Elizabeth felt something twist inside her. She closed the New York deal in half the expected time. George added, that kind of instinct? You either have it or you don't. His eyes flickered toward Elizabeth just for a second. She gripped her fork a little tighter. Richard leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, completely engaged in the conversation. That's a huge responsibility. I'm sure the board was thrilled. Victoria shrugged, feigning modesty. They were. But you know, I wouldn't be here without Dad's guidance. Elizabeth swallowed down the bitter taste rising in her throat. It was always like this. Victoria, the rising star. Victoria, the perfect daughter. Victoria, the one who could do no wrong. And how about you, Elizabeth? Martha's voice was smooth, pleasant, too pleasant. Anything new? Elizabeth met her mother's gaze, trying to decipher the meaning behind the question. It wasn't about her career. It was about one thing. She placed her napkin down carefully. No change. A silence stretched across the table, just long enough to make her stomach tighten. George exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down with a dull thud. It's been years, Elizabeth. The shift was almost imperceptible, but Elizabeth felt it. The subtle change in energy, the unspoken expectation tightening around her throat. She felt Richard's gaze on her. He didn't speak. He didn't defend her. George leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp. You know how important this is. The Brown family name. I know, Dad, she cut in, her voice steady. Do you? His expression seemed to say. Because if you did, you wouldn't still be failing us. A cold realization crept in, sinking deep into her bones. Richard's admiration for Victoria, his distance, the way he had been avoiding difficult conversations, staying out later, making excuses. And Victoria, sitting there, glowing under their father's praise, watching Elizabeth carefully, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Elizabeth suddenly felt like she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't yet see. But it was coming. And when it did, it would change everything. The doctor's voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as if delivering this kind of news had become second nature to her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Clark. The treatment was unsuccessful. Elizabeth nodded, swallowing hard, but the lump in her throat refused to disappear. She had told herself she wouldn't cry this time, that she had prepared for this. But still, the words stung like fresh wounds. Are there any other options? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Dr. Schmidt sighed, offering a sympathetic smile. At this point, Elizabeth, we've exhausted every viable course of treatment. I know how much this means to you, but... A pause, a hesitation. Maybe it's time to consider other paths. Other paths. She knew what that meant. Adoption, surrogacy, acceptance. Acceptance of what, though? That her body had failed her? That her father would never forgive her for it? That Richard... She closed her eyes. She didn't want to think about that now. The drive home was a blur, the soft hum of the car engine barely registering over the storm raging in her head. But as she pulled into the driveway, a sharp jolt of unease cut through the numbness. An unfamiliar luxury car sat parked in front of the house, sleek, black, and expensive. Her stomach twisted. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. She stepped into the living room and froze. Her parents sat side by side, stiff and formal. Victoria, perfectly composed, perched on the arm of the couch as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. And Richard. Richard stood by the window, his hands tucked into his pockets, staring out into the snow. No one spoke. No warm greetings. No pretense of casual conversation. Something was wrong. Elizabeth's breath came shallow as she slowly set down her bag. "What's going on?" George Brown was the first to speak. His voice was calm, deliberate, businesslike. "Sit down, Elizabeth." She didn't move. "Sit," he repeated, firmer this time. A heavy sense of dread settled in her bones. But she did as he asked, lowering herself onto the chair across from them. George folded his hands together, studying her. Finally, he exhaled. "It's time we face reality." Elizabeth felt the air shift, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "You cannot give this family what it needs," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "And we cannot allow the Brown legacy to weaken because of sentimentality." The words landed like blows, but before she could fully process them, he delivered the final strike. "Richard will be divorcing you." Her mind blanked. Her mother didn't flinch. Victoria crossed her legs, watching carefully. And Richard, he didn't turn around. Elizabeth's throat tightened. "What?" Her father didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Instead, he nodded toward Victoria. "She is young, capable, and most importantly, she can give Richard an heir." The world tilted. Elizabeth turned to her sister, searching for any sign of hesitation, of guilt, of humanity. But Victoria only smiled. Not mockingly. No, that would have been too obvious. It was a careful, measured smile. A victor's smile. "This isn't happening," Elizabeth whispered. Richard finally moved, slowly turning to face her. She looked at him, desperate, pleading. This was her husband, the man she had built a life with, the man she had fought for. He wouldn't let them do this. "Richard," she breathed, barely able to speak his name. His expression was unreadable, but his silence said everything. She shook her head, her vision blurring. "Even you?" Richard inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening. Then, with a quiet finality, he said the words that shattered her completely. "I'm sorry. It's not possible with you." The room swayed. The people she had trusted the most, the ones who were supposed to stand by her, had already decided her fate. Without her, her father, cold and calculating, her mother, detached, her sister, triumphant, and Richard, the man she had once loved, the man who had just chosen her replacement. The betrayal burned, deep and consuming, hollowing her out from the inside. Elizabeth gripped the armrest, steadying herself as the walls closed in. For the first time in her life, she was utterly, completely alone. Elizabeth moved on autopilot. Hands trembling, she yanked open the closet, pulling clothes from their hangers without thinking. A suitcase lay open on the bed, its emptiness mocking her. She stuffed in the essentials, jeans, sweaters, a few personal belongings, but everything else? It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. Downstairs, the murmur of voices continued, their casual detachment like knives to her skin. They weren't arguing, weren't second-guessing, weren't wondering if this was the right decision, because to them, it was already done. Zipping up the suitcase, She grabbed the handle and turned toward the door, only to find Richard standing there, blocking her path. His face was unreadable, not cruel, not regretful, just empty. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The house, the car, whatever you need. We can settle this quickly." Settle, like she was a business transaction. A contract to be closed. Elizabeth gripped the suitcase tighter. "I don't want your money, Richard." He exhaled sharply, as if she were being unreasonable. "There's no need to be dramatic. You deserve something for the years you spent." She cut him off, her voice raw. "I don't want anything from you." Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone before she could name it. Maybe relief, maybe guilt, but not enough. Never enough. She stepped past him, moving quickly down the staircase, ignoring the eyes that followed her. No one spoke. Not her father, who had already dismissed her. Not her mother, who had perfected the art of looking through her. And not Victoria, who sipped her wine like she had already won. Elizabeth didn't say goodbye. She walked out into the cold, the snow falling thick and heavy around her. Her car door groaned as she yanked it open, the chill seeping into her bones. She tossed her suitcase into the passenger seat, slid in behind the wheel, and turned the key with a shaky breath. The engine rumbled to life. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. This house, this family, had been her entire world. She had done everything right, followed every rule, sacrificed her dreams, her pride, herself to fit into the mold they had carved for her. And in the end, it hadn't been enough. It would never be enough. A hollow, aching silence filled the car as she pulled out of the driveway, tires crunching over fresh snow. She didn't look back, didn't watch as the mansion faded behind her, swallowed by the storm. Instead, she stared straight ahead, blinking against the tears that finally came. She had nothing. No husband, no family, no plan, but somewhere, beneath the grief, beneath the bone-deep exhaustion, something else stirred. A decision. She wasn't going to let them break her. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to start over. The rain in Seattle was different from the snow back home. Softer, gentle. It didn't bury or smother, it washed things clean. Elizabeth sat at her desk in the corner office of Robinson Architects, absently running a finger over the edges of a blueprint. Months had passed since she'd driven away from everything she'd ever known. Months since she had felt the sharp sting of betrayal cut through her. Now, her days were filled with structure, with design, with projects that gave her a reason to wake up. Her new boss, Michael Robinson, had taken a chance on her. Hired her on the spot after seeing her portfolio. He didn't care about her last name, her past, or the legacy she had walked away from. She wasn't Elizabeth Brown here. She wasn't Richard's wife. She was just Elizabeth. A knock at her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Michael leaned against the frame, easygoing as ever. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his sleeves rolled up as if he had been knee-deep in work himself. "You're still here?" he said, tilting his head toward the clock. "It's after 7. Elizabeth glanced at the time, surprised. "Guess I lost track." Michael smirked. "You always do." He stepped inside, setting a folder on her desk. New project, an elementary school designed with sustainable materials. "I want you to take the lead on it." She blinked. "Me?" "You." His expression was unreadable, but there was something knowing in his eyes. "You've got a talent for creating spaces that actually mean something. I think you'll bring something special to this." Elizabeth hesitated, her fingers brushing over the folder. I've only been here 3 months. Michael leaned against her desk, arms crossed. And? She searched for an argument but found none. A warm voice called from the hallway. Dad, are we leaving soon? Elizabeth turned toward the sound. A girl stood at the doorway. Samantha, Michael's 10-year-old daughter. Her thick curls framed a face filled with curiosity. Her backpack slung over one shoulder. She stepped inside without hesitation, her small fingers tracing the blueprint on Elizabeth's desk. You designed this? She asked. Elizabeth nodded. I did. Samantha studied it, eyes bright. It looks cool. Michael chuckled. That's high praise coming from her. Elizabeth smiled. She had met Samantha a few times before, but there was something about her. Something open, unguarded. You know, my dad designed our house, Samantha said proudly. Did you know me before I was born? Elizabeth frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, did you pick me before I got here? Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She's trying to ask if she was chosen before she was born. Elizabeth's heart clenched. I'm adopted, Samantha said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Dad picked me when I was 5. Something in the air shifted. Michael placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. More like we picked each other. Elizabeth looked at them, this father and daughter bound not by blood, but by love. And for the first time in a long time, something inside her softened. Later that night, as she packed up her things, Michael lingered by the door. Samantha's taken a liking to you. Elizabeth smiled. She's an amazing kid. She is. He hesitated, then added, So are you. A warmth spread through her, unfamiliar and terrifying all at once. Michael was kind, steady. Nothing like Richard, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. So she only smiled, tucking the blueprint under her arm, and said, See you tomorrow. As she stepped out into the Seattle rain, she realized something. She didn't feel lost anymore. The months blurred together, filled with early mornings at the firm, late nights over blueprints, and weekends that no longer felt empty. Elizabeth hadn't expected to build a life in Seattle, but somehow, piece by piece, it had begun to happen. It started with work. Michael trusting her with bigger projects, giving her the space to create. Then it was dinner, invites, small at first, just casual meals after long days. But before she knew it, she had become part of something more. Samantha would burst into her office after school, animatedly talking about her day. They'd spend Saturdays exploring the city, the 3 of them moving like a family without ever calling it that. Until one evening, when Samantha made it real. They were sitting in the living room, Elizabeth on the couch, reviewing sketches, Michael scrolling through emails beside her. Samantha was sprawled on the floor with a coloring book, humming to herself. Without looking up, she said, Did you know me before I was born? Elizabeth glanced at her, confused. You've asked me that before. Samantha grinned. I know, but I like saying it. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. She likes to remind me that she wasn't just born into my life. I chose her. Samantha sat up, beaming. That's right. Dad chose me. The words settled in Elizabeth's chest, warm and steady. Dad chose me. Not because of blood, not because of obligation, because of love. That night, as Elizabeth lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about the family she'd left behind. The one that had measured her worth by what she could give them. An heir, a name, a legacy. And then she thought about this family. The one that had formed around her, not because she was needed, but because she was wanted. It wasn't until weeks later, on a quiet evening, that Michael finally said the words out loud. I love you. He didn't plan it. He didn't make a big moment out of it. It was just the two of them in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Samantha asleep upstairs. Elizabeth had laughed at something he said, a real, unguarded laugh, and when she turned to him, he was looking at her. Really looking at her. And then, just like that, he said it. I love you. She froze. Michael didn't rush to fill the silence. He just waited, patient, steady. And in that moment, the last of her walls crumbled. She took a breath, stepped forward, and whispered, I love you, too. And that was it. They got married in a quiet ceremony, Samantha throwing flower petals down the aisle with the biggest grin on her face. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth wasn't a Brown, wasn't Richard's wife, wasn't bound by expectations or duties. She was simply Elizabeth Robinson, and she was happy. Then, the impossible happened. The nausea came first, then the fatigue. She brushed it off, blaming stress, a busy schedule, maybe even the Seattle rain, until she sat in a doctor's office once more, bracing for news she had been told too many times before. But this time, the doctor smiled. Congratulations, Mrs. Robinson. You're pregnant. Elizabeth went still. Pregnant? It wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. She stared at the doctor, waiting for the moment she would correct herself, waiting for the mistake to be revealed. But it never came. Sometimes, when couples adopt, the pressure of infertility eases, the doctor explained gently. Stress can be a powerful thing. Elizabeth barely heard the words. Her hands rested on her stomach, her heart pounding. For years, she had been told she was defective, that she would never have children, that she wasn't enough. And yet, here she was. A miracle. That night, she told Michael. His arms wrapped around her, steady as always, and Samantha's excited shriek filled the house. Elizabeth closed her eyes, holding on to them both. She had lost everything once, and somehow, she had been given more than she had ever dreamed. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air as Elizabeth guided her twin daughters, Sophia and Harper, through the bustling Seattle mall. The girls, barely 3, clutched her hands tightly, their matching golden curls bouncing as they chattered about the candy store they had just passed. Behind them, Michael carried the shopping bags, amused by Samantha's ongoing debate with him over which college she should apply to. She had grown so much, now a poised, confident young woman, full of dreams and possibilities. Elizabeth was happy, really, truly happy. She never thought she would get to a place where the past no longer haunted her, where the sting of betrayal had faded into something distant and unimportant. But then, she saw them. Just across the food court. Her breath hitched. Richard. Victoria. Her parents. She hadn't seen them in 3 years. For a moment, she didn't move, only took them in, registering the ways time had worn them down. Richard's once polished appearance was frayed at the edges. His hair had thinned, deep lines etched into his face. The confidence, the quiet arrogance he had always carried, was gone. Victoria stood beside him, stiff, her smile long faded. The glow, the effortless charm, vanished. And George Brown, the unshakable man who once dictated the course of her life, sat hunched at the table, gripping his cane. His presence, once powerful, now felt small. Martha, ever composed, was speaking to him in hushed tones. But even from a distance, Elizabeth could see it, the weight of disappointment pressing on her mother's shoulders. They looked defeated, a sharp contrast to the last time they had all been in a room together. She should have felt satisfaction, should have relished in the reversal of fortune. Instead, All she felt was certainty. She had made the right choice. Michael must have sensed the change in her, because he followed her gaze. His hand brushed against the small of her back in silent support. That's when Richard looked up. Their eyes met, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then, recognition dawned. His gaze shifted, scanning the scene. Michael beside her, the twins giggling as they clung to her legs, Samantha waiting patiently by her side. His expression hardened. He stood, stepping away from their table, moving toward her. "Elizabeth?" His voice was lower than she remembered. She met his stare, calm, steady. "Richard." He hesitated, then glanced at Michael, at the children. "Is this your family?" She didn't even have to think. A slow smile spread across her lips. "Yes, my real family." Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Regret? Envy? It didn't matter. Victoria appeared beside him, her expression unreadable, but there was no arrogance left. No triumph in her gaze. Elizabeth had heard the rumors. Victoria couldn't have children. The irony was almost poetic. George had spent his entire life obsessed with bloodlines, with heirs, with ensuring that Brown real estate remained in the hands of his true descendants. And now, there were none. None that mattered, anyway. Elizabeth took a breath, standing a little taller. She reached for Michael's hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Let's go," she said softly, and together they turned away. No bitterness, no anger, no final words of revenge, because she had already won. The conference hall buzzed with quiet conversations as families, social workers, and supporters took their seats. Elizabeth stood at the front of the room adjusting the microphone. The banner behind her read, "The Robinson Family Initiative, because every child deserves a home." 5 years ago, she had walked away from the only life she had ever known. Now she was here, not as Elizabeth Brown, the daughter who had disappointed her family, not as Elizabeth Clark, the wife who had been cast aside, but as Elizabeth Robinson, a mother, a wife, a woman who had built something real. She glanced toward the front row. Michael sat with Sophia and Harper, their little feet swinging as they clapped their hands together. Samantha, now nearly an adult, gave her an encouraging smile. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth began. "We are a family bound by love, not blood," she said, her voice steady, strong. "And we want to share that experience with as many children as possible." Michael stepped beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her back. The Robinson Family Initiative helps connect children with families who are ready to love them. Because family isn't about who shares your DNA. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves you, unconditionally. The audience erupted into applause, but Elizabeth barely heard it. Because just beyond the crowd, standing near the exit, was Victoria. She was alone. Her once perfect posture was slumped, her confident glow long gone. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, cautiously, Victoria stepped forward. "Sister," she began, then paused, correcting herself. "Elizabeth." Her voice was softer than Elizabeth had ever heard it. Victoria hesitated, exhaling shakily. "I said terrible things to you. I believed terrible things." She swallowed hard. "And now I see how wrong I was." Elizabeth waited. "I want to help," Victoria said, eyes uncertain. If there's anything I can do." For a long time, Elizabeth had imagined this moment, pictured herself turning away, walking past her sister the way Victoria had once done to her. But she wasn't that person anymore. She had found happiness, not in revenge, but in love. And love? It had space for forgiveness. Elizabeth extended her hand. "Come by tomorrow. We'll find a place for you." Victoria's eyes welled up, but she nodded, gripping Elizabeth's hand like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Later that evening, as Elizabeth sat outside with Michael, watching their daughters chase fireflies in the backyard, she felt a deep, quiet peace settle inside her. She had been cast aside, betrayed, left with nothing, and yet she had gained everything. She looked at her family, at the life she had built from the ashes of her past, and whispered to herself, "The greatest betrayals can lead to the greatest blessings." If you love gripping stories of betrayal, resilience, and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button now.